The sudden departure of Absa's first black CEO, Daniel Mminele, is a big step backwards. This is in particular with regard to the transformation agenda. It's brought into question the experience of black executives in the corporate world. For insight, personal experiences and solutions to the challenges faced, we're joined by businesswoman Nolita Fakude. Joining us later in this conversation will be Langa Madongo, who's the Deputy President of the Association of Black Securities and Investment Professionals, and Olisani Dlamini, who is from the UCT Graduate School of Business. Ms. Fakude, let me begin with you tonight, and thank you so much for making time and being available for this conversation. Firstly, just tell me from your own perspective how you've been processing the news of Daniel Mminele, and I suppose you've had a couple of days to really try and see what has been going on here.
Thanks, Kathy, and good evening. For me, the sadness around what is playing out in the public domain is the fact that we can no longer ignore the elephant in the room. And that elephant in the room is the fact that corporate South Africa still has not transformed from a racial perspective and also from a black executive perspective. 30 years later in our democracy, with all the frameworks, the legislation and regulations and policies, advocacy bodies like the BMFs and APSIPs and BLA and everybody else, we still are faced with a situation where we don't have a robust pipeline of black talent to take over any position available in South Africa.
It's incredible to me that once the news of his departure broke, the immediate reaction and analysis was specifically around transformation in corporate South Africa. And I thought that there could have been so many other reasons that people may have picked up, but that's been the core issue. Why do you think that has been? And perhaps as somebody who has been an executive in multiple organizations within the South African landscape, what is happening behind those glass doors that perhaps the rest of the country is not fully aware of, and the true experience of black executives, powerful and educated people like yourselves?
Well, two things. If you are going to get any change or transformation take place in your organization, you do need visible role models. And for us as black women and black executives, we don't see enough people who look like us in those corridors of power. So when you have one who looks like you, then move away for whatever reason. You then start to feel a sense of loss because you realize that actually the status quo has not changed yet. So that's the first part. The second one is the fact that when you reach an executive position in any company, black or white, male or female, it's few of you. And therefore it's a very challenging space to be part of. It's a lonely space to be a leader. It's even lonelier if you are the black person, the one only or one or two women or two black people around. And therefore when these kind of sudden changes happen in any organization, everybody wants to know why, what went wrong. And because our transformation journey is still evolving, everything is suspect, regardless of how you can explain the departure or the appointment or no appointment. So there is a sense of lack of trusting the system because obviously not everyone knows what's happening behind the boardroom. I mean the boardroom doors. And therefore, when there is lack of communication or there seems to be a perception of lack of transparency and these visible role models we're talking about, then it is a situation that causes all of us to want to start checking what is actually happening.
Given the fact that there are so few black executives at the kind of level that we're talking about, are we still looking today at somebody like Daniel Mminele and saying he was the exception rather than the rule? And is there still an environment that makes black executives want to feel that they should be grateful to be in the kind of positions that they've been put in?
No, not at all. Any black professional in South Africa today, black executive and also a woman executive, are there on merit. For them to get to any position in the country, they are there on merit. Obviously, each organization has got its own unique dynamics, and therefore you've got to have a situation where you make sure that the culture of the organization and that of the individuals in the organization are aligned. But there is no issue around having black exceptions. The challenge is that you have to ask the question, why is it that our talent pipeline still is not as diverse as it should be in terms of not only the skills competence, but from a race perspective, gender perspective, generational perspective, all other diversity dimensions. Why is it that 30 years later, we still are not seeing that diverse pipeline come through?
Nolita Fakude is a businesswoman. Joining us after the break is Langa Mandongo, who is with the Association of Black Securities and Investment Professionals, and Olisa Dlamini from the UCT Graduate School of Business. Do stay with us. Well, we continue our conversation looking at the state of black executives in the country. Joining us for this discussion, businesswoman Nolita Fakude, and slipping into studio, Langa Mandongo, who is the Deputy President of the Association of Black Securities and Investment Professionals. Langa, good evening. Welcome to the conversation. And perhaps let me just begin by bringing you in and giving us the view in particular of how you read what has happened with the Absa scenario in terms of Daniel Mminele.
I think we find ourselves in a very strange space. I think we are constantly lamenting the continued dearth of black executives and professionals that continues to display itself in terms of our financial services sector. I think we continue to see that a lot of the black professionals who get into these spaces suddenly depart, and in some instances the messaging around it is not clear as to what the black professional would have done, and we're not getting a clear understanding of what support was given to allow those particular black professionals to excel in the space. I think we all know that Dan is one of the most highly regarded finance professionals with a stellar track record, and then the messaging coming out of Absa is that there wasn't a meeting of minds on certain issues around strategy. And for us, it's also then going to always be us wanting to understand what was the support that was given to Daniel to ensure that he excels in that role. And in those points where there was those misgivings or those misunderstandings, what were the interventions that the board, as the custodians of strategy and culture, would have done in order for them to make sure that Dan was able to transition well into the role that he was taking in what is probably now the most unwanted job in the country, because we would all be scared to find ourselves being in that role. Yeah.
One of the things that has been raised by others who are studying the situation is, where does authority really lie? And when we look at the reasons that were given out of Absa for why they came to this decision, they said, well, when one looks at it, it was ultimately a decision between the talent that has been with Absa, that formed part of the executive, that threatened to leave, or letting go of Mr. Mminele. What do you make of that? And do you think that him coming into a position already where it looked like he did not have very clear authority over some of his executives was a recipe for disaster anyway?
I think, as I've said, the board remain the custodians for strategy. They also remain the custodians for culture. And they are the ones who have to ensure that whoever is in the positions of leadership are singing from the same hymn sheet, and they are the ones with the fiduciary responsibility ultimately per the Companies Act to ensure that the business is sound and is moving in the right direction. For me, I think one of the things that stands out, as you have said, is that is this a case of the tail wagging the dog? And is it a situation whereby now you are saying that the power lies with the other members of the executive? And if the board still felt that Daniel was a strong candidate and representative, what levels did they go to support him in those times when they were having these areas of conflict? And I think I can also say that it's also then an intriguing one, because one needs to then understand the extent to which there was this schism between him and the executive. Was it the whole executive or was it some members of the executive? And how did we come to a position where the executives are guiding the board?
Nolita, you understand these processes better than most. Is it a difficult position to have where you have executives seemingly not agreeing with their CEO?
Kathy, any team development dynamics involve certain stages. And there's theory around this. If you look at it, they say there's a stage where you are forming a team. Then there's a stage where you are storming as a team because you're trying to find each other and understand each other. Then there's a stage around norming, setting up the values and common purpose as a team. And then there's a stage where you perform. And then eventually you move to another stage. And from an organizational perspective and a big organization like the one we're talking about, you expect that to happen within the first 12 months. And obviously, as the decision maker, as the CEO, you lead the executive of the company. And the backing you expect from the board is that they would support your processes, because any CEO gets appointed, doesn't matter where they are, which country or which color they are, in the first 12 to 18 months, they also want to shift the decks and appoint certain people in the positions that they feel and believe will help the organization succeed and also support their own strategy. So that stage where when you get to the storming particularly, this is where you expect that the board objectively and independently will support and facilitate that the organization moves beyond that stage. So this is where, when you look and listen and read what's in the public domain, it gets to be really opaque.
So it's not unusual and not unexpected that you would have these ructions at an executive level around where an organization is going, and perhaps the need for somebody in the position of a CEO to really leave a part of their imprint, because ultimately it's their legacy, it's their name. When people talk about that organization, it's a direct reflection on them because they become the face of the organization.
We actually call it the cabinet reshuffle, because when a new CEO gets appointed, you say, I wonder what's going to happen, what are the changes that are going to happen. So this is not unusual. It does happen. Where I suppose there would have been a challenge is the fact that you have had a situation where there was a vacuum in the leadership period where there were acting people. And obviously, when now a new person and authority comes in, there's going to be a pushback. But this is where we are saying with Langa, the role of the board in that instance is to understand within that context and facilitate. Look, we are now, it's hearsay because we haven't engaged. But the point is, when you're talking about organizational dynamics and leadership dynamics, these things happen.
Nolita was speaking earlier, Langa, about the issue of grooming new talent and the pipeline that needs to exist within corporate South Africa in order for the transformation agenda to really be given the kind of focus and credibility in terms of corporate South Africa really buying into it. And she was saying that that doesn't exist right now. Do you agree?
I think we have come somewhat of a way, but we still particularly within the corporates, need to see that they are planting their own timber. We do need to see a greater extent of profiling of the talent that is being developed, them being given numerous platforms to also showcase themselves. I think one of the things that we have to do going forward is to continue to hold corporate South Africa more accountable for them being able to show us what it is that they're doing in order for them to develop the succession pipeline. I think a big part of it has been that I think we have been comfortable in many instances where we assume that if a CEO is leaving, they'll find someone else from another institution. And I guess sometimes that does go to the elements of then you have that period of storming being a little bit longer than if you had grown your own timber. So I think, yes, there is a dearth in terms of the number of black professionals that are being groomed within the corporates to ensure that we have that robust pipeline.
Going forward, and is there a particular message that this sends to black professionals and potential executives about what their future in corporate South Africa might be?
Well, it's obviously very disappointing. And as I had said earlier on, for any transformation and change to happen, you need visible role models. So a young professional who's in the financial services environment or in any other sector for that matter, the first thing they look at is to say, who are the top 40 CEOs in South Africa? Black CEOs who look like me or who are women. Currently, top 40 CEOs in the country, you only have 4 women out of 40. And then black, it's probably 5 or 6. Now, that is a damning track record, regardless of what we say. So what is it saying to a young up-and-coming professional or someone with aspirations and goals? It's really to think, is this where really I want to be at, and how do I get there when in a country where you've got so much diverse talent and the majority of your population is black and the majority of your population is women, you do not see that reflected in the organizational structures. That's a challenge. How
do we begin to increase the accountability? Because the figures will stay the way that they are for as long as possible, because it supports the status quo. The fact that it's not changing to me suggests that there are people who don't want it to change, in fact, who may well be comfortable with the fact that it is the way that it is.
Yeah, I think we need to be a lot more vocal about these things that we're seeing. I think, as Mminele has said, the challenge is it's not only about race, it's also about gender. We have a lack of diversity. It's also about age. We have very old boards at many institutions that are not transforming across all those sectors. And I think one of the things that our legislation has tried to do is to create a platform where people change on the basis of their own goodwill. Maybe now we need to be transitioning into a place where we're no longer doing it on the basis of the carrot and it's a little bit more stick. I think as long as we continue to...
But sorry to interject there. Some corporates are okay with paying their fines, paying those fines, because ultimately it's a drop in the ocean compared to the kind of profits that some of these companies are making anyway.
Yeah, I think we have to take it a step further. I think it probably has to go to the element of the right to do business. The right to do business should be linked to your ability to look like the people with whom you're doing business. I think particularly in the financial services space where we spend our time, it's quite easy in terms of some of the legislation speaking to issues of licensing, for example, and what are some of those requirements, and you having to develop a transformation plan. We're not saying let's disrupt the system, but we're saying let's create plans and let's give more punitive measures, as you are saying, to take us to where we need to go.
Kathy, 10, 15 years ago, you used to drive on the highway and see a billboard saying, we are company XYZ, we are BE level 1, proudly so.
Yes.
What happened to that? Obviously, the license to operate was very clear that you needed to be a certain level of conformance to those standards. Now, if the regulators are not enforcing some of that, it makes it difficult. But it's not only the regulators, it's the advocacy groups like the APSIPs that we're talking about in the BMFs, who have to continue to challenge the status quo. Because if we do not do that, the transformation, we will be sitting here and lamenting and see nothing happen going forward.
And in terms of advocacy, how far do you think that that advocacy should be going? Because, you know, we'll see the voices come out whenever there is an issue as big as, you know, Absa letting go of Mr. Mminele. But that then dies down, and we wait for the next big thing to happen before we hear these voices again. There doesn't seem to be a consistency, or is that just an impression that is created from somebody like myself from the outside looking in?
I think our advocacy is consistent. I think we continue outside of the events and outside of the public platforms to engage and to participate in forums like the Financial Services Transformation Council. We continue to engage with National Treasury. We engage with the SAB. We engage as much as we possibly can also in issues of policy and in closed session dialogues where we are trying to champion some of this policy and the movement in this direction. I think you'll find that if you speak to the regulators and you speak to those who are in the corridors of power, the advocacy groups are continuing to consistently engage. And we think our engagement is not only with the regulators, we're also engaging with the corporates. We've put our hands up numerous times to many corporates to say, look, as you formulate your journey and as you look for your path in terms of how to transform your business, let us engage with us. Let us tell you what the thinking is of the investment professionals. Let us tell you what the thinking is of black business. Let us help you shape the journey as well, and not only as someone who's going to speak out when you're doing the right thing, but someone who's also going to praise you when you're doing the right thing, but who's also going to be with you, holding your hand as you walk the journey towards being a transformed entity.
That would fall along the lines of support for organizations. Let's talk about support for individuals. You raised it earlier, Sis Nolita, about how lonely it can be for many black executives at the top.
Well, the support is also around these organizations that we're talking about, because part of the role of the Black Professional Associations is network and supporting each other, because you are talking to colleagues and peers who understand the journey that you are going through within your own company, and therefore help each other with tactics and also survival.
Sounds like a war zone.
It's an ongoing struggle, and I suppose mentoring and coaching happens within and outside the organizations. So there is a lot of the support that is there for professionals generally. It's just that when you are one in a pond of, remember, an exco is normally 7 to 10 people. It's not a big group of people. So if there's only 2 of you who are black or women, you do feel that you have to work through a lot of issues. In most instances, if the culture is such that it's not aligned for everyone to feel that it's enabling them to thrive and operate to their fullest potential. Because you can imagine you are coming in, you want to deliver and perform because you've come this far because of your competence, not because anyone is doing you any favors. And then you come in and you realize that the culture is not a nurturing one, it's not an enabling one for you to perform to your fullest potential. You are going to be diverted because you'll be dealing with other issues that have nothing to do with the job at hand. So that's the challenge. So the support is there. People continue to talk to each other, but it is a challenging leadership role.
It sounds like we still have a long way to go based on this conversation. Hopefully we'll have an off-the-record briefing that will become on the record around what exactly some of these specific challenges might be that are facing executives in corporate South Africa. Well, that was businesswoman Nolita Fakude and Langa Madongo from the Association of Black Securities and Investment Professionals. Kolanjinga standing by. He'll have a look at your sport after this. Do stay with us.